Hello guys, Bn146 here. So I decided to cover a couple more games from the President's Cup 2021. If you haven't seen my recap of the whole tournament, you should check that out first. Now this is round 3. I was paired against FIDE Master John Hasford, the highest rated player in the country, former national champion, absolute legend. And someone had never scored a point against, not even a draw. Before this game, I'd played him a total of 5 times, I think, in Classical and Rapid. And I lost every single one of them. And even worse, I lost them without playing very well. I always, for some reason, just played terribly against him. So far, the tournament has gone pretty well. I had 2 out of 2, and I was paired against him for the 3rd round. So I was playing him from the black side. He started 1 d4, I played knight f6. He played c5, I responded c5. And when I prepared to go into these Gambit type lines that I prepared for this particular tournament, and he had a critical way to continue to continue with d5 for white. That really puts the question to black. And then there are many ways you can continue with e6 to play some sort of Penoni or b5, which is what I'd prepared to go in to go for a full Benko Gambit. But he played a bit more cautious with e3, which is fine, but also doesn't really give white the maximum advantage that he can get in the position. So I played e6, he played knight c3, then I took on d4, the pawn took back, then I played bishop b4, and I just have what looks like a fine position. It's like a Nimzo Indian, but then you're missing these 2 pawns. And in general, when you have a central pawn for a non-central pawn, it's a good exchange, right? So exchanging the c pawn for the e pawn should be a very good version of the Nimzo, which is already a very, very good opening. So I felt like I can't be much worse. He went knight f3. I pushed in the center with d5. No reason not to. He went bishop d3. I castled. He castled. Now I need to figure out a way to bring out these 2 pieces into the game and have them make sense, especially my bishop here on c8. That's usually the main problem in a lot of these structures. So I went for this setup with d takes c4 first, with the idea of luring the bishop here to c4, and then I go queen c7. And the tempo that I get on the bishop, I use to develop my other pieces. Another way of doing a similar thing is to start with a6 instead, where I'm threatening to go b5 with tempo on that same bishop, and then I bring my bishop here on b7. And I did something similar in the games. But here I decided to start with queen c7 first, hitting the bishop. He decided to defend the bishop with queen e2. And then I did play a6 after all, because again, if you're going to leave the bishop on c4, then I'm also going to want to get tempo on that bishop with a6 b5. So he delivered the other bishop to g5, threatening to take my knight and then ruin my kingside pawn structure a little bit. So I played my knight to d7, disallowing that, and also now committing fully to playing b5 and bishop b7, because now the bishop is definitely not coming out via this diagonal. So here he played rook c1, eyeing my queen here on c7, hinting at some possible x-ray tactics. They are not present here because of these 2 pieces, but then it's something that you always have to start looking out for. And so it started to make my queen feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I can continue with b5, but again, that's kind of playing into his plan. So like the bishop retreats somewhere, and all of a sudden, if you're going to play bishop b7, you have to start calculating all these kinds of reveals with the knights that I really didn't want to. So I wanted to move my queen somewhere. I really did not want to come to b8 before my rook comes out, because it's never really a good idea. If my rook were already on c8, I wouldn't mind dropping the queen to b8 at all. But here, I still have to figure out how to develop my pieces. So the queen going to b8 wasn't particularly attractive. So I decided to go for something else. I played h6, and the idea of h6 was to force the bishop to make a decision, because I knew he probably does not want to give up that bishop for nothing for my knight on f6, and so he will probably play bishop h4, which is what I was counting on, because it frees up this square f4 for my queen, and that's where I wanted my queen to go. So I played queen f4, and he played bishop g3. The queen has to go to g4. He played h3, the queen has to come to h5, and of course I had to see all this before I decided to play h6 over here, because that's, I mean, it's not really forced, but it's a very natural sequence of moves. After queen g4, h3 with queen h5, I realized that my queen is not getting trapped, and if my queen is fine here on h5, then yeah, I don't really see any problems. I'm going to continue with b5. I'm going to put my bishop here on b7, and I'm going to argue that I'm completely equal. So he played a3. Now this was a surprisingly tricky move. Again, putting a question to my dark square bishop, do you really want to take? For one thing, you maybe want to dream of in the future playing against this isolated pawn. So you probably don't want to take and have him take back with the b pawn and fix his pawn structure. and then you don't really know what you have in answer for his bishop pair. So the temptation is to somehow retreat the bishop and then try and keep this pawn isolated. But that would actually be just losing, and I'm glad I was able to spot, because the bishop goes back. All of a sudden, he has completed development. You still have not. You have two pieces here to join the battle. And he can just continue with something like rook fe1. And the point is, a move like d5 will very soon be absolutely crashing. Because of where the bishop is, there's a pin here on this pawn. And so after d5, this pawn cannot take back. And so after preparing the move, he's soon going to be crashing through on the e file before you can get your pieces into the game. So after a3, bishop takes c3 was actually just forced. And then he took back very curiously with the rook. Again, a very interesting decision. You can also take back with the pawn and try and fix your pawn structure a little. But then that makes the move rook ac1 seem a bit silly in retrospect. And so you'd rather have put the rook somewhere over here. So yeah, there's good and there's advantages and disadvantages to every move. So he decided to take with the rook instead to make his move rook ac1 to c3 make a lot more sense. And then try and argue you can take over the c file before I can complete development, which is also very possible. But of course, the downside is that it keeps the d pawn isolated and possibly weak in some endgame. So I continued with my plan of playing b5. The bishop came to d3. I put my bishop on d7. And now I've completed development, and I'm arguing that I'm actually just equal. And it's actually just in time, because if he has just one more move, and he's able to stabilize on the king side, and he's just going to play like rook c7 and take over the position. And if he's able to do this at a point in time when I don't have any counterplay, I'm just lost. I mean, I don't have anything. So it's very timely that I had the bishop b7 in this position where I'm planning to take on f3. And the point is here, you can't go rook c7 because I will snap take on f3. Doesn't want to take with the pawn and hang this pawn, so he has to take with the queen. Then I'll ruin his pawn structure a little. And I'll just defend my guy. And these two weaknesses would definitely be more than worth the file that I give up. So I mean, if he goes like this, I'll move the knight somewhere and try to win this pawn or that pawn. And I have more than enough counterplay here. Black is actually the only one pushing for a better position. So because of that, my bishop b7 was actually just in time, and I managed to complete development, and I'm actually just equal. So he has to answer the question of what to do with this knight. So he plays knight e5, forcing the queen exchange. My queen doesn't really have any squares, so yeah, we are forced to enter this endgame. And of course, I have to play rook c8 to stop him from taking over the c file. And we enter this endgame, which is extremely interesting, very imbalanced. He has the bishop pair. It's an open position relatively with pawns on both sides of the board. So in any sort of endgame, that bishop pair is going to be, it can be very, very terrifying. On the flip side, I have this isolated d pawn to play against, and at least for now, there are some major pieces left in the position I can use to target this pawn. So here he played knight d7. I took back with my knight, and then he doubled rooks on the c file, just threatening to take over the file. I played knight b6 to give some support to my rook here on c8, so that if he wants to exchange rooks, I'm game. And also trying to maybe threaten to jump into one of these three squares, either c4, a4, or d5, where the knight looks like is a fairly decent piece. Here he played b3, which is a very good strategy when you are playing against a knight like he is. You always want to take away advanced support squares from the knight. So this move takes away both of these squares from my knight, and the knight can only go here where it's actually interfering with the activity of my bishop, so my pieces start to look a bit silly. And here I thought and tried to figure out something to do, but I couldn't see any way to make any progress, because he's completely bossing this file for now. I can just hold him at bay. Here I think I was actually even afraid of him playing something like rook c7 and trying to create something, but he just went for the safe b3. So I don't really have any way to improve my pieces any longer, because after like a knight here, he can even go just like rook c5, and then again my pieces are sort of interfering with each other. So here I sort of played a nothing move. I played rook fd8, and I mean I'm pretending like I'm attacking this pawn, but of course I know his response is going to have to be rook c8, and I'm going to have to take back. So it's like at this point, although it's my turn, I just gave him a move to play again, and then he took, and then I took back. That's the exact thing that happened, because I just didn't have any good moves. So I just played rook f d8. We exchanged all our rooks, and then we entered this minor piece endgame. And now the balance has switched a little, because the thing about isolated pawns is that they are best attacked by heavy pieces, basically queens or rooks. So now that all those heavy pieces are out of the game, the weakness of this d pawn is not so much felt as it was in basically all the 24 moves before this point. And so the strength of his bishop pair is starting to threaten to look more important than his structural weaknesses. So he starts with bishop c7. He's a very experienced endgame player. He can really press you in any sort of slight advantage endgame. So here I started to not feel so confident. And the point of the move bishop c7 is, of course, to take these squares away from my knights, so that my knight is now a bit more limited. So the knight came to e7, no problem. Then he continued a4, opening up the pawn structure here on the queen side, increasing the activity of his bishop. You have many options. I can play like a bishop c6 to try and hold down the b5 square, or I can do what I did, just take on a4. The pawn takes back, so the bishop where it is will hold down this pawn on a6. But again, his pieces are now starting to look way better than mine, because his light square bishop is just better than mine now, probably. And then his bishop is definitely better than my knight on e7. So yeah, it's starting to get a little uncomfortable. I play king f8. But in the game, I think I was actually quite optimistic. I thought I was getting to this pawn faster than he can defend it in most lines, which in retrospect feels a bit funny. So I wasn't really playing with the idea that I have to hold this endgame. I really thought I could pose him a lot of problems. Of course, the computer laughs at both of us and just says 0-0-0 from like 10 moves ago. But yeah, it can be very different when you're actually playing these over the board. So you play bishop e5. The idea is to keep an eye on this pawn here on g7, so that my king doesn't really have the freedom to go away. But of course, I just played f6, kicked the bishop away. He went to d6 to pin my knight. I brought my king into e8. Then he played g4, gaining some space here on the king side. And now he also wants to bring his king into the center along the dark squares. But again, like I mentioned, I always felt like I'm getting to the center a lot faster than him. And in particular, I'm getting to this pawn faster than him. So I play king d7. The bishop went to c5. And here I realized it's not so simple for me to make progress, because the bishops are just so dangerous. I wanted initially to just move my knight somewhere. So maybe I can play e4, bring my king into the center. And I realized here that whenever I move my knight, he's starting to play this move bishop f8. And bishop f8 is actually just going to win all my pawns on the king side. They are all on dark squares. And once the bishop gets behind them, it's going to be very difficult to hold. So I had to find a way to solve this particular problem. I decided on the move knight g6. The idea is, of course, to defend the f8 square, physically. But that wasn't just it. After king h2, the plan was to go here to f4. And the point is that the knight lands on this square with tempo on this bishop. So at least for one move, he cannot play bishop f8. And whenever the bishop retreats, probably to f1 or here to c4, I'm going to play the move g5. And that was my idea. Because after g5, whenever he does go bishop f8, then I can play h5 and my knight holds down that pawn. And the pawns are not so weak. So it's not difficult. It's not so easy for him to get to the weak pawn, which is now on f6. So exactly that happened. He retreated the bishop to f1. I played g5. So here he went king g3. And you realize that with the time that I wasted having to solve this little problem of my pawns being on the dark squares, his king is now also entering the battle, and at least he gets to the center as quickly as I do. So I realize here that I don't really have any advantage at all. But yeah, the game still remains to be played. So here I continue with f5. And the reason is that, of course, he doesn't take. If he takes, I think then I'm a little better, because it exposes his pawn a little more. And more important, I get a 3-on-2 here on the king side. And so I might be able to create a pass pawn at some point in the future because of this 3 versus 2. So, I mean, if he makes that slight inaccuracy, which I don't think he ever would. And also, I just want to liquidate a little, because as it stands, my pawns here are actually quite weak. And if the game goes on, again, this dark square bishop might just be the end of me. So I played f5. And he responded h4, which I thought was a very interesting move. I hadn't really seen it from afar, so it came as a bit of a surprise. But yeah, it's very combative. It doesn't... not sitting down to give me any sort of initiative. So here I drop my knight back to g6. Of course, I cannot take the pawn because my knight would hang here on f4. So I drop my knight back to g6, trying to keep the tension here a little bit. So he took on f5, and here I thought he had made a slight inaccuracy, because basically I can take this pawn here on h4. Not with the pawn, that would double the pawns and be very ugly. But I took with the knight, and my idea was that I get a passed pawn. I mean, it's very simple. Material is equal, but the difference is that I get a passed pawn. And I thought that would be very interesting. So I did have to make sure that the move f6 did nothing though. So I spent like, I think, almost 10 minutes looking closely at this move, making sure there was nothing clever happening. I'm forced to go king e7. And then his king can try and come in. He can try and bring his bishop in. The bishop can come here. From afar, it looks a bit scary, but I realized in all the lines that I'm getting to the pawn too quickly, and it's just very safe. So I went for knight takes h4. That was very interesting. So he took on e6 rather than play f6, and then my king took back. And then he played bishop c4 check, which is the other problem. So now that I do have a 2-on-1 on the queen side, it means he also has a passed pawn here in the center. And although we've been calling that pawn isolated and weak the whole game, now with the cover of a bishop pair, you realize the pawn is very powerful, and it already has protected squares up onto the 6th rank, which is very dangerous. So here I played king f5, and I'd seen a sequence of moves that I thought was very nice for me. In fact, I thought I might just be forcibly winning that pawn and might be close to at least playing a more pleasant version of this endgame, being the one playing for the win. So I played king f5, and he goes d5. And then I went king e5, and this is why I ended my calculations, because I was like, wow, he can't push the pawn because I have this move, knight f5 check, and I win the pawn. And I thought maybe he hadn't seen this from afar, so I thought I'd been very clever with this little shuffle with my king and coming here to e5. And so I thought maybe I'm just winning the pawn and I'm playing for advantage. And then I saw his next move. And it's funny when you blunder, you almost always see it before the opponent plays it, and then it's like you're feeling very confident, and in the next second you're feeling like you want to kill yourself. And of course the move is f4. It's very simple. I should have seen this, but yeah, I can't take the pawn because my knight is hanging, and my king has to move, so I can no longer attack this pawn. And it's actually very fortunate that my king has a couple of squares that don't immediately lose. f5 loses on the spot. He takes, he pushes, and basically in all these lines it's very important that my knight has this square f5 to check and then try and stop the pawn on this square. So because my king inhabits this square in these lines, it actually loses. And of course my bishop is not free to protect these light squares because the bishop is stuck protecting this pawn here on a6. So you realize how his bishop pair here in the endgame is proven to be very deadly. But fortunately, my king does have a couple of squares. One was e4, which I went for. I think f6 was also just okay, held on. So I played king e4. He took on g5, I took back. He pushed d6. And here I went bishop c8. And again, here I was very afraid because I thought here he was just winning with the move bishop takes on a6. And I guess I was also going a bit down on time because I thought this is just winning, because if I take back, he goes d7 and I lose. So I can't take back. He's just won a pawn for nothing. If I go here, he goes there. And again, I think I lose. So, but there was just one sequence that held, which is knight f5 check. I probably would have found this if he had gone for it, but I hadn't seen it from afar, so I wasn't too comfortable. And the point is, of course, he goes somewhere and I take. Okay, he doesn't go there. That's probably also fine. And then I take here. And if he takes here, I take there. And the knight just protects the bishop so that if he takes, I'm able to take back and I hold. So he saw that, of course, so he didn't go for bishop takes. And somehow that made it a lot easier for me. So he went for a5 instead. And here my king was able to come back to e5 and it wasn't so dangerous anymore. So he pushed d7, he took on a6, exchanging his passed pawn on the d file for my a pawn. But I'm not anywhere near as afraid of this a pawn as I am the one that was on the d file, because it's a flank pawn for one thing, and also it's nowhere near as advanced. So my king just joined the action. The bishop dropped to f2. My knight checked. The king came to g4. The knight moved away with check. discovered check by my bishop, setting a little trap. Of course, he can't take because of reasons, and even that endgame is still completely drawn, I guess. It's probably not even difficult, but yeah, no reason to go in for that. So after knight d6 check, he went king f3. Then I pushed g4 check, just getting a tempo in. The king went to g2, and I played bishop b5. And after playing this move, I was sure that I was definitely not in any danger any longer, simply because the bishop has no squares. The knight takes them both away, so he's forced to exchange. And once you take away that bishop pair, you realize that the position is completely harmless. And here we agreed to a draw. So it was quite a tough game. Like I mentioned, I hadn't scored a point against him before. This was my first half point, so I was proud of it, but also because the play itself was actually quite strong. And from Leach's analysis, there were like 0 mistakes, 0 blunders from both sides. And really, that's the level of chess you have to play to even hold against these guys. They can play some very strong chess. So in retrospect, I was quite proud of the game. Although my assessment of it wasn't too accurate, because during the game there were a couple of moments where I sincerely thought I should be better, but I was never better. The game was mostly just drawn, I guess, equal from the beginning. So yeah, it was a tough game, but also a very nice game. One of the few games from the tournament that I'm quite proud of. Like you probably already know, the rest of the tournament didn't exactly go according to script, but these are a few games that I still look back on with fond memories. Okay, bye. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment, drop a like. Happy chessing, and I'll see you later.